Hi and welcome to this Inspired Learning podcast with me, Phil Parker. We've had slight technical difficulties, which is why we're doing this, to see how we can make it work. So apologies for that. Hopefully there are some people watching out there. If there are, there's a little box just to this side of my screen that says you can ask a question. Pop a question in and then I'll find out if I'm talking to anyone or just to myself. So I'm Phil. I'm the designer of the Lightning Process. I'm an expert trainer in NLP, hypnotherapy and life coaching, and the author of 4 books. The whooping that you may have heard earlier on has gone away as the Lightning Process, I think, is almost finished now, so hopefully you won't be disturbed too much by that. You may hear the tappity tap of my friends over there working hard. So first thing I'm going to talk about is NLP. Hopefully some of you are familiar with NLP. NLP stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming, and what Neuro-Linguistic Programming does is it allows people to start to take charge of their lives by looking particularly at their neurology, which is obviously how your brain works, your language, the linguistic part of the word NLP, and programming. Programming meaning how you can change that stuff. Now, the reason the word program sneaks in there, and also the word linguistics, is the origin of NLP comes from two guys, Bandler and Grinder. Grinder was a professor of linguistics at California University, and Bandler was actually a computer scientist studying at the same college. And so their idea was, how do we get people, how do we understand how people work, not from a guesswork, but can we strategically consider how people work and how they don't work very well, and help to change how they operate. So that's what NLP is. A quick little exercise to get you an idea of the kind of thing we're talking about here is to take your right foot and to move it, just turn it in a clockwise manner at the ankle. And as you do that, just get familiar with that. And then at the same time, with your right hand, draw a 6. And as you draw a 6 with your right hand, notice what happens to your foot. The original clockwise motion starts to get interrupted because our brain is connected up in all sorts of fascinating and interesting ways. And we can start to see here some of the patterns that are going on because we are very used to patterns. We're very used to seeing things. So a classic example is if we get somebody to look at this and we say, what is that? Most people would say, well, that's a sleeping or a smiling face. There's nothing really there that's face-like. The faces aren't really even round or spherical. Eyes don't look like that. Mouths don't really look like that. But we're very good at recognizing patterns. And this is great for us. It means that we can make sense of things very quickly, but it also is problematic in that we can start to see things that aren't really there. We can see patterns that don't really exist. And when we do that, that allows us, much like the predictive text of a mobile, to fall into a false sense of understanding reality when actually we don't have a complete version of it. And actually, that's where a lot of people's problems come from. So, I got a note from somebody saying somebody is watching. This is fantastic. It's Becky. Hey, Becky, I think. So, and I can see Fiona down there. Hello, Fiona. Cheers. So the other thing that's really important to know about, apart from the fact that our brain predicts, like predictive text, we know how good predictive text is at predicting the word we're trying to say, and also how horribly wrong it is. It can predict exactly the wrong word. And if you look on the internet, you can find lots of examples of that. The other thing that's really important to know is about states. That everybody is always in a state. We're always in one state or another. So as we sit here, we may be very focused on this part of the world, or we may be distracted by noises and sounds. Our focus of attention, what state of mind we're in, is really, really important. Because the state of mind we're in will dictate how we deal with something. And very often, with us humans, one of our biggest problems is we are in the wrong state. So when people, for instance, go to an interview, very often they're in the state of nervousness, but it's probably the least useful state for them to be in. When people are in a traffic jam that's stuck and they're in a hurry, they're in the state of frustration, and that's probably, again, the least useful state to be in. And this is the real question about states, is the state you're in the most effective and important state? And very often the answer is no. And the second problem we have is not only being in the wrong state, is even though we may notice that it doesn't feel right, we don't have really any good ideas as to how we get out of that state. And again, this is where NLP and coaching and hypnotherapy to some extent all come to your rescue, finding ways to shift from state to state. If you think about anywhere your life is stuck, anywhere things don't go the way you want them to, anywhere you get into an argument or conflict, anywhere where you feel less than your best, these will be exactly the moments when you were in the wrong state. If we have an argument with someone, you know those arguments afterwards, you're going to go, oh, I wish I hadn't responded in that way. What you're actually saying is, I wish I hadn't been in that state. I didn't know how to be any other way. It seemed the normal way to be, but it didn't help. And what we need to do is kind of get behind the hood of the engine and see what's going on. How are we getting into these states? Well, one of the reasons we get into these states is something called neuroplasticity, which is something I've written about a lot. Neuroplasticity uncovers why it is that this happens. If you imagine a little nerve coming along here with a signal, the signal can go one of two ways. It can either go along this pathway here, which let's say goes to pain, or it could go along a separate pathway which goes to happiness. And at this area here, this is our synapse, where it can go these one of two ways. If we constantly trigger the pathway that goes up to pain, then what actually happens is these two nerves start to move together, and the nerve that goes to happiness starts to recede. So it makes it much, much easier for the pathway to pain to be triggered. That's neuroplasticity, that by using a pathway, in this case a negative pathway, a lot, allows those two nerves to almost join, so that pathway works very, very effectively. The other good thing about neuroplasticity is that neuroplasticity is a process, and it doesn't care which pathways we're activating, whether it's the pain pathways or the happiness pathways. It will only help to develop pathways that we use a lot. So if we start to use a pathway that takes us into happiness or motivation or excitement, much more than we take pathways that lead us into boredom, frustration, pain, fear, then these pathways will become dominant in how we use our brains, and therefore how we use our lives. So one of the questions I was asked was about motivation. Motivation is a state. There are things we are constantly motivated for. One of the interesting things is people can be very motivated to procrastinate. They can find lots of ways to get in the way of achieving what they want to. That's a motivation strategy. And we can use that. NLP would say every behavior is useful. How do we use this behavior usefully? If you're distracting yourself when you should be getting on to jobs, then what you're doing is altering your focus. Well, that's brilliant. All we need to do is teach you how to alter your focus so you're focusing on the job at hand. One of the simplest ways to do this is to use something that NLP calls submodalities. Submodalities are, if you think about this teacup, you close your eyes and you think about the teacup, you'll see it in your mind. The question is, where do you see it? How far away is it from you? How big is it? Exactly how red was the redness? How big was the handle? What was the lighting like? How much did it reflect the light? These qualities of that image are called submodalities, and it turns out, according to NLP, and you'll find this by checking out yourself, that changing the qualities of the image, the submodalities, actually changes how you feel. So if you take that image of the cup and you make it tiny and small, you make it dull and you move it far away, it will change just how you feel about it. The same thing with motivation. When people find it difficult to maintain motivation, normally what happens is this: they have an idea of the thing they want. So I'll take this piece of paper here. Okay, this is what I want. I want half-price hot pots. Okay, and they kind of look at it in their mind, and they keep on seeing, and they get excited, and they go, I must do this. This is important, because this kind of zone in front of our face is where we keep imagery that seems to be important for us. And it could be negative or positive, but it's the things that we need to keep an eye on. When we get demotivated, what happens is these things fade in our vision. They disappear, they become further away from us. Or what happens is new pieces of information come in, and they jostle for position and start to take our interest. So, oh, I must get the washing done. Oh, I'm a bit tired. And these drag our attention away from what it was we said we wanted to do, which was to follow this. So the easiest thing to do, if you have something you want to do, that you're very clear you want to do, but then you keep on not doing it, which is very, very common, is to create a good picture of that and to place that in front of your face in this kind of peripheral, central vision, rather peripheral vision, and then to make it brighter, to make it bigger, to make it sparkle. And by doing that, it will start to be alluring. If you have any other stuff creeping in, like I better go and clean the hamsters, or I just go and wash my car or have a cup of tea, and take those fleeting images and move them to one side, clear some brain space so you can start to think about the thing you want. And then of course the other thing is, what state would you need to be in? What would be the best state in order for you to get that kind of change? So if you want to be motivated, well, all you need to do actually is to think about a time when you were really, really motivated, and we've all got that in our lives. It may be, when you were a little kid and somebody said, we're going on holiday and we're going to get up early, and as the alarm rang and your mum or your dad came to wake you up, how excited you were, how motivated you were to get on with it. Or it may be when you've got a date and you're really excited about going on it, or a gig, or something to go to. Everyone's got something they're really excited about. Just by recalling that, you will get in touch with the neurology that encourages that way of thinking. Because motivation is a state, and what that means is it's an activation of certain nerve pathways and the triggering of certain chemicals, certain neurotransmitters, dopamine and all sorts of other stuff. By triggering those pathways, you can replicate that experience of being motivated. Now, one of the other things I've done is I've invented a new word, which is the word do. That's D-U. I'm going to write this down. It's probably the easiest way to do it. D-U with a circumflex, which looks like that. As you do. Okay. That's back to front. Hopefully you can see it. Good. So D-U. What the D-U says is that actually we are constantly involved in processes, in states. Very often people will say things like, I am stressed by the world economy. But actually what's more appropriate to say is the world economy isn't stressing them. That's just doing its thing. They're doing stress to themselves. And we use the do with the circumflex. You're doing stress about that. And the do with the circumflex says you're not doing it on purpose. It's an unconscious response, but it is you. And the good news is, because it's you, that means you can do something about it. You can actually interrupt those pathways, because the state of frustration or stress is just the result of triggering certain neurology, certain ways of thinking. And that can be changed. That can be switched off really, really easily. The problem you get, of course, is if you keep on switching it on, like we said earlier, you get into a neuroplastic change where the brain starts to do that all the time. So we want to do the state of motivation. That means we need to activate the state of motivation. It's a fascinating experiment by Ellen Langer. Many of you may have heard of a professor at Harvard, where she had these guys and she said, right, we're going to take some basic readings of your health. They're in their 50s. And then she sent them off to this monastery, which had been decked out like it was a 1950s house. So they went there, and as soon as they went there, had to change into 1950s clothes. They ate 1950s food. They talked in 1950s slang. They watched 1950s programs on a 1950s black and white TV set. Everything was 1950s. So they didn't just recall the 1950s. They re-immersed themselves completely in the 1950s experience. By doing that, what they found, they were able to completely re-engage, and when they tested them on their return, they found that the markers of their health had improved. They seemed to have become younger purely as a result of immersing themselves in the experience. Now, we don't have to, build a monastery or a house that looks like what it's like to be motivated, because we have the world's best multimedia projection system right here inside our heads. We know this, don't we? Because we noticed how absolutely scared we can be by creating a little image in our head. People who make horror movies know that. They know that all they need to do is just to trigger some little thoughts for us to make us think there's a crocodile underneath every bed, or every creaking door is the sign of some dreadful intruder. They know it doesn't take much for us to trigger an even better movie than the one they're showing on the screen. We can equally do this for powerful positive states. We can get ourselves into a state of motivation simply by generating a brilliant sense of what it's like to be excited and motivated. So if you're having issues with any states, the first thing to do, once you've worked out what the state is to start to allow yourself to re-immerse into memories of being in that state. And that brings us on to the lightning process. The lightning process is a way of doing that. It's a way of helping people to identify when they're in the wrong state. And the lightning process specifically looks at health. And it says, we know that our health is affected by our neurology, because the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, which manage all the very basic functions of the body, are controlled by the brain and various neurotransmitters and hormones. So if we can get inside the machine, if we can get inside our neurology and get it to instruct our body to behave in a more healthy way, then we can get physiological rebalancing and change. And the way to most accurately and effectively stimulate and rebalance your nervous system is by using this multimedia system we've got in our head. How do we know that? Well, simple examples. If you've ever been embarrassed and you feel yourself going red and blushing, that's your brain and your emotions creating physiological change in the capillaries in your skin. Before an interview, many people experience going to the toilet. Again, this is thinking, changing your emotions, affecting your physiology. So we know there's a very clear linkage between what we think, how we feel, and how our body works. But it's even more powerful than that. Our body is so phenomenally affected by what we experience, by our external sensations. So doctors telling us things, or friends telling us things about our health, but even more powerfully by what we say and show ourselves in our minds, the visions we create. So we need to be very clear that what we're doing with our nervous system is moving us forwards. And if anybody's ill, then naturally they're going to be generating a whole bunch of neurology and thoughts that aren't very healthy. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just the consequences of that will further cause problems in your immune system and the way your whole body functions. So anything you can do to improve the way you think, to improve the way you manage your neurology, will improve the way your physiology responds. It's very simple. It's been looked at for thousands and thousands of years. In recent years, Walter Cannon, again Harvard professor of physiology in 1930, first looked at this, the psychoneurological immunological response, PNI. It's been looked at by Hans Selle, the Canadian professor of endocrinology, looked at the stress response, and it keeps on being looked at by professor after professor. It's a very, very well researched bit of science that says that how we respond to things, how we deal with stuff, affects our health. What's really interesting is all those studies are about how we deal with stuff. It raises the question, can we learn how to deal with stuff differently? Can we learn how to use our brain and body in better harmony? Because when we can start to influence the things we can influence. There are things we can't influence. We can't influence how many bugs there are on the air, you know, what our genetic heritage is, but there's lots of stuff we can influence. And genetic heritage is a really interesting one. The people used to think that our genes were just our genes. That's what we had. That would cause certain responses in our body. That's just the way it is. Turns out it's not the case. So the new science of epigenetics says that all sorts of things, how stressed we are, what food we eat, what the pollution is like, what chemicals are in the air or in our water supply, affects all sorts of tiny things like methyl bonds, which bind chromosomes together. And that will show which part of the gene, which part of the chromosome is actually activated, which bit is expressed. So we can have a whole string of nuclear material, but only one section is used at a time. And because it's all coiled up, the ones that are open and available are the ones that actually code the proteins, and the proteins in turn move stuff around. Okay? So your genes are your genes, but which bits are being used are determined by all sorts of factors, including, so say, what we eat and what we think. So again, we can see this linkage between the power of our bodies, our health, and the way we think. And a lot of this problem that people have about your mind and your body as separate comes from the work of René Descartes, famous French philosopher, who started to look at a distinction between the two things. What people forget about René Descartes is a philosopher and a mathematician, but also he was a very spiritual person, and one of the things he tried to do was to try and find the seat of the soul. So when people go, the mind and body are not connected, they forget the person who suggested that was somebody who was very interested in looking at souls, and he actually thought it was sitting in your pituitary if you read his writings. But they've decided to take a small portion of one of the things that he said and justify this separation. What I find intriguing about the mind-body split is most people's experience is that the mind and body are massively interconnected. Like I was talking about blushing, feeling nervous, having your butterflies in your stomach. Most people, I would say everybody's had one of these kind of experiences, that we know that our mind-body link is alive and well. The question is, how do we get to change it? And that's a lot of what I look at in my work and books. If you want to know more, then various websites you can go to, lightningprocess.com or philparker.org. Lots of free resources there. Various books I've written, which you can see there as well. And of course the NLP podcast. If you want to know more about NLP, there's 10 free podcasts that talk about some of this sort of stuff. You can get straight from iTunes. It's 10 times 10 minutes, that's 100 minutes, so it's nearly 2 hours free stuff. If you want to buy more, you can buy them from iTunes as well if you want to go further into it, and various courses we run. So I'm going to kind of pause now, answer any questions you have, if there are any. Because I've been rabbiting on for the last 25 minutes. So any questions for anyone? I'm not sure how the questions thing work, but we'll find out. Hi Michael, there I can see you. Thanks for saying hi. I think if you want to ask a question, you need to use that little question answer box on the right. Cool. It's interesting, it shows up people's faces at certain places, but I don't know why. Okay, so if there are no questions, I'm going to close this first seminar. If you found it useful, then please just send me a message. It'd be really interesting to hear how it was for you. It's a bit weird because I'm basically talking to my own face here, which is obviously a beautiful thing, but it's a bit odd. So hope it was good for you. Speak to you guys soon. You take care. Bye.